So when I first saw this, my thoughts were not, wow, this is going to replace all the cool instruments that I have at home, like my flute and my guitar and my other keyboards. No, what I thought was, what an interesting piece of musical randomization to add to my toolkit. Hey friends, good morning, Bart here. It's Friday. A little sad, it's the end of our reInvent week, but hey, it was a really great time. Last night we had the big replay party. Big shout out to AWS Cloud for throwing out such a cool party. They fixed a lot of the line flow problems that we had last year as well. Great food, lots of drinks. Got to see Jen Lasher play on the EDM stage, and then we also got to see the almighty Anderson .Paak rock the house as well. So really great time. Got to hang out with a lot of the CBT Nuggets crew at the party last night. And now it is Friday morning. Looking back on the week, and in particular yesterday morning, we had the Werner Vogel's keynote speech, which was another great addition to this week of, sustainable topicality. Now, first of all, Vogel's got into a great look at the history of virtualization and the evolution of it from EC2 on into things like the Nitro hypervisors and then on into Firecracker as well. And so if you're kind of getting into the AWS space and you want to take a look at how they have addressed some of the big hypervisor and virtualization problems over the years, definitely take a look at the Vogel's keynote speech. His dive into how they evolved into Nitro, super interesting. And then after that, they brought Claire Ligori out, who is the lead on the Fargate team, and talked about how they use the Firecracker micro VM virtualization technology to drive the Fargate service. Pretty cool stuff. After that, we had an interesting look at the EBS Physalia technology that they're using. And really, this is kind of an interesting approach to how the EBS volume store technology in the background handles both consistency and availability problems. Very cool stuff. Now remember, Physalia is not a new product. It is a mechanism that they use in the background to handle the EBS durability and, like I said, the availability and consistency problem. Very cool. Again, take a look at the keynote speech for a little more info on it. But I think one of the most interesting speeches that they had in the keynote was when they brought out Sebastian, and I hope I say this right, De Hallo, and his team from Saildrone. Really interesting stuff here. So these guys have built these wind-powered boats that can sail around in the oceans collecting all sorts of interesting metric data. So not only are they able to cruise around and take video, snapshots, they can apply a number of interesting machine learning patterns out there to the images they're receiving back. And then, of course, they have a huge array of sensors that are on these boats, allowing them to gather temperature information, barometric pressure, salinity levels, dissolved oxygen. There was quite a few different resources that they were able to read into. And the interesting thing that's going to happen here is that Sebastian and the Saildrone team are looking to basically tap into a data set that does not exist yet. When we think about all of the world's oceanographic studies that we've done, we still don't have one common centralized database that's global. We have focal areas in different parts of it, maybe specific aspects of marine biology life that we have, but nothing super comprehensive and nothing that's completely planetary. So Saildrone's goal is to divide the planet up. I believe they said 1,000 different 6-degree zones that they're going to have, and use these Saildrones to go around and really extensively map out not just the physical layout and the seafloor using sonar technology, but also doing animal density and fish population count, looking at diversity counts as well. Really interesting stuff. And let's face it, in order for us to combat the situation that we're finding ourselves in with our planet here, we're going to need every single piece of information we have and all smart hands on deck to try to really overcome this. So kudos to the team at Saildrone there. I hope that this is a project we're going to see a lot more interesting things come from in the future. Definitely something to keep your eye out for. And again, I want to give a big shout out to AWS for keeping these topics on presence this week. I thought it was really great to hear all the keynotes talking about sustainability and the impact that AWS in the technology world has and can have even farther in the broad world. So in addition to all the cool keynotes, there was also a bunch of great service announcements. And as I've been cruising through this week, sitting in lines, chatting with people, I've been asking them what some of their favorite service announcements were. Some of the big ones that keep bubbling up is the AWS Builders Library. Now this is really interesting. Basically, AWS is kind of pulling the covers off of the back-end hood and really revealing how a lot of their mechanisms and their systems interoperate in the background, just like the way we were talking about Physalia just a few minutes ago. And so the Builders Library is there to help ensure that other builders and developers out there can look at the best practices and the processes that Amazon has leveraged to accomplish what they are doing right now, so that we can help accomplish even more given the way that we apply systems and indeed design the new systems that haven't been created yet. So really excited to see what the Builders Library can bring out. After that, there was provisioned concurrency for Lambda. So this is an exciting model that allows us to control the depth and the parallelization of Lambda, generally focusing on startup times and making sure that as we go through changes in performance requirements, Lambda can be either pre-provisioned or be able to respond quickly and appropriately to ensure that it can meet those demands. Really cool stuff, and I know that's going to help a lot of people out there, both with regular Lambda functions and with step functions as well. After that, one of my very favorite products in the catalog, Elastic Beanstalk, good old Elastic Beanstalk, been around for quite a long time. They just added support for spot instances. So this is going to be a really great way to go and add the manageability of Elastic Beanstalk and then add an additional cost optimization on top of it. Really cool. Can't wait to play around with that one. And then the final one is very near and dear to my heart, and that is the Identity and Access Management Policy Analyzer. This has been something that I've had on my wish list for quite some time now. They used to have a thing called the Policy Simulator, and it was all right. You could put in hypothetical scenarios and get results of applying an action against a policy to see whether it would pass or fail, and which statements would cause that. But it was clunky. It wasn't very programmatic, so it had a lot of problems in it. And consequently, a lot of organizations have to manually, well, or at least programmatically design a way to go through and review their security policies on a regular basis. So IAM Analyzer allows you to target your IAM policies kind of almost passively in the background and have AWS take a look at drift and configuration problems that are occurring in there. Classic example would be the headline doom-bringing public S3 buckets or unknown S3 bucket access problems. So by using the Policy Analyzer, we should be able to identify those problems and then help mitigate them much more easily. So this is a good thing. A lot of people really struggle to get the IAM pieces correct the way that they need to. And unfortunately, it leads to security problems, breaches, and like I mentioned a minute ago, really bad headlines. So kudos to AWS for all the new service announcements. This is just the tip of the iceberg. And like I said, I'll be sure to increase, next week I'll be sure to kind of come through and look at even more of the service announcements that came out and try to bring you a little more background info on them. If there's any announcements that you're really excited about, share them with us. You can chat in the comments below or hit me up directly if there's something that you want to hear more about. And finally, one of the more interesting and kind of personal things that I ran into this week was getting to check out the new artificial intelligence and machine learning keyboard, Deep Composer. And I have it right here. I went to one of the workshops and I managed to get one of them. Now, the first thing to kind of point out here is that this is not really so much of a musical keyboard as it is meant to be a learning tool for the machine learning and artificial intelligence space, very much along the lines of what Deep Lens and Deep Racer provided in those same aspects. So if you're wondering, can this thing make amazing music? Imagine how Deep Racer gets itself around the track. That is an awful lot like what the music sounds like coming out of this. But in the background, the technology that drives it are called generative adversarial networks. And it's a pretty interesting form of machine learning, technically one of the more complex ones, because what you have to have is a noise generation system. So you have one side of the application is the generator, which creates things that it thinks should be created. In our case, it's creating musical notes in a particular time pattern across a particular melodic range. And then on the other side, you have a discriminator. So imagine the orchestra producing the music, and then the conductor is the one who says yes, no, good, bad, ugly. Okay, so in a generative adversarial network like this, you're creating the generator and then the discriminator models to kind of work together. So this is pretty interesting because both sides of it have to be trained and developed over time to produce the results you're looking for. So ultimately, I think AWS's goal here is to try to really breathe some life into GAN-style generative adversarial network research and try to really push that venue forward. Now, that being said, as a musician, I was intrigued by the possibility of being able to play music with this computer. Now, I've been through a lot of MIDI controllers over the years. I use loop stations at home, and so I'm pretty comfortable with some of the mechanics of using what I call assisted live music. So when I started to play with Deep Composer, of course I started trying to play out some little licks and some little songs that I knew. And one of the first things to remember is that it's limited currently to only 100 beats per minute. Can't change the tempo. It only samples 8 measures. It does use just standard MIDI, so even though this is an AWS branded keyboard, I believe that if you hooked any sort of MIDI device up to it that would send a MIDI signal in, it would work with that as well. Now, ultimately, what's happening here is the melody that we provide is basically the generator noise part of it. It's going to look at that and model what it tries to create based on the input that we provided. So this is really interesting because as I started playing with it, I found that the different combinations of how I played the keys in, it definitely affected the way that the generators worked. Furthermore, they had a couple of different models built in to replicate different types of music. So they had like a rock, pop, jazz, they had a symphonic one, and then they had another one for Jonathan Coulton, who was the guy that performed at reInvent this week. And essentially, all of these different generator models have different ways of interpreting the input melody and then different sorts of output that they try to create. Typically, there was like 4 tracks that it would create. There was a drum, and then 2 or 3 other auxiliary instruments that it would try to play with. Once it had generated the composition, as you can see, you can go in and change the different instruments that might be played by that particular part. And it also shows right on the screen the visual MIDI music part of it so that you can kind of get a feel for what's been played there. Now, what I found was it was interesting. If I played little single note melodies like boop, beep, 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 boo, it didn't have a whole lot of data to work with. But if I got into playing full chords, boom, 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 beep, I found that the more spectrum that you had covered and the more rhythmic the music was that you were playing, the better and the more interesting that the generator produced. So I saw a lot of really bad press about this thing as soon as it got released earlier this week. A lot of people saying, what the heck is this thing? The music sounds like like a terrible old like video game at times. And for me, as soon as I listened to it, I was like, well, those are just bad MIDI samples that they're using there. And indeed, I think that's exactly what a lot of the first impression was here. Because as I got to playing with the different instrumentations and the voices that you could add to it, I was able to come up with some pretty interesting stuff. And beyond that, when I would add the melody in, it would come up with interesting fills and little runs and stuff that it would try to play on the different tracks. The other cool thing is too, you can hit the generator multiple times and it will slightly change the composition that it has produced. So I found myself very interestingly for hours here sitting around playing little melodies and things that I was enjoying and then running through the discriminator, changing the output instruments, and I was able to come up with a lot of really interesting pieces. In the end, what I think is going to be really interesting is to see how people are able to take this technology and use it for the music world, because it definitely had some interesting pieces in there that I would pull those out of the composition and use them. In fact, as you can see here, I'm going to go through and use the samples that they've provided me from the composition. I'm going to go through and record them individually and then mix them down with a regular drum track in the background. And I think you'll see that it produces a pretty interesting amount of music, given somebody who has a little bit of creative flair to kind of take what they've created with the AI music part of it and blend it into a more traditional music piece. So when I first saw this, my thoughts were not, wow, this is going to replace all the cool instruments that I have at home, like my flute and my guitar and my other keyboards. No, what I thought was, what an interesting piece of musical randomization to add to my toolkit. And let's face it, if you've ever listened to jazz, or even if you're into music like Skrillex and some of these advanced kind of EDM musics out there, it is about experimental sounds, experimental timings. And so having an AI engine like this produce pieces that I provided input to and it responded to me, that is a lot like playing music with musicians on stage. And I've been in lots of jam sessions where somebody played a horrible note that was off key or was out of time. And so I'm generally forgiving of good old Deep Composer here. And in the end, I think it's going to produce some really interesting results. The other side of it too is that as an educational tool, what a great way to learn about generative adversarial networks and the technology and modeling tools that have to be used in the background. FYI, SageMaker and Jupyter Notebooks are used in the background to do the model manipulation parts of it. Now, this is all very much pre-release, pre-beta. There was a lot of features in there that aren't supported. You can see a bunch of these different buttons on here that look very exciting. Very few of these work yet. In fact, this is really just a standard MIDI keyboard from Amazon that they rebranded with the AWS logo on it. So you could use this with other MIDI applications as well. But down the road, I hope that we're going to see a lot more interesting things come out of Deep Composer. So I hope everybody's having a great week. I know I had a good time at reInvent. I do want to say thanks to AWS Events. Thanks to everybody who was here this week, all the attendees, all the great initiatives that we talked about this week. If there's anything you want to hear about from me, please let me know. And until next time, friends, stay up to date. Follow me on Twitter there at CloudBart, and of course, subscribe here on YouTube as well. And we'll see you in the cloud. Cheers.